Ice and Fire. Chapter 1. The planet Harrmow was cold, very cold. Its landscape was as white as it was bitterly cold. A human with long blonde hair and sharp angular eyebrows, clad in simple clothes, the clothes of a slave worker, looked upon his surroundings with contempt. This had been his prison for over a year, and he was sick of going to bed cold and waking up cold. Conditions for the Dalek slaves had allegedly been improved by the Demon of Mercy about a year ago, and while there had certainly been fewer deaths, Dio did not believe these changes were for the better. It was like the other slaves had become ignorant, blind to their own situation. Sure, they were made comfortable, allowed to establish their own rotas and protect their women and children, to carve out the barest semblance of a life, but to Dio there was no difference between being a happy slave or an unhappy slave. A slave was a slave. Dio had been a privileged young man before the Daleks invaded his home and took him prisoner. He had seen his house staff exterminated after he had left them behind. He tried to escape the assault, but his cowardly father had made it to the escape craft first. Since then, Dio had bided his time. He had made little fuss and gotten on with his work. Perhaps he did a little less than some of the more exemplary slaves, like John, who looked over to him now, his arms full of metal girders. "Feel free to pull your weight any time, Dio," he said with little animosity. He was a nice man, thought Dio. He believed in the best people had to offer. This was his greatest weakness. The slaves on Harrmow looked to him almost as their leader. Can spineless slaves really have a leader? That implies they follow anyone's orders but their Dalek masters. Perhaps representative was a more fitting word. "Sorry, John," Dio said, and he made it sound as convincing as possible. "I was merely contemplating our sad fate on this planet." "It could be worse, you know. Conditions are much better now than they ever were before," replied John with a smile. Dio looked at him with pity. He truly believed that. The poor fool. "You do realize that while we live in relative comfort, we are doing the Daleks' work as efficiently as we like, helping them to conquer and enslave more worlds. You're helping them win," Dio said with a sneer. "You mean we are," John corrected him. "Perhaps. But for how much longer? I suppose we shall see." "What do you mean?" John asked with wide eyes. "You're not thinking of stirring up trouble?" "I am thinking of escape," Dio said with fire in his eyes. "The Daleks have grown lazy here. There's only half a dozen in the outpost, a skeleton crew to oversee the humanoid workforce." "Still more than enough to wipe us out without a qualm," John retorted. "I say we don't give them a chance, John. Are you with me? The others listen to you, look up to you, myself included." Dio tried to make the lie as convincing as possible. "We don't need to fight. We merely have to escape." "There's nowhere to escape to." "That's where you're wrong. There are subterranean caverns. The temperatures are a little higher down there. I've investigated one a couple of times in my rest periods. If we could lead our people into one, we could easily lose ourselves down there. Keep moving. We may find remnants of the civilization that lived on Harrmow before. Carve out a new life for ourselves, free from Dalek tyranny." The fire of rebellion blazed in Dio's blue eyes. John looked at him with concern. "And if we are caught, we'll be executed as traitors," he warned. "We're hardly traitors for wanting our freedom, John. The opposite, in fact. We are traitors for cooperating with the enemy of our people." "We made the best of a bad situation," John cried. Dio saw this as his moment of weakness. He put a hand on his shoulder gently. "I know, but if we could turn that situation into a better one where we don't answer to the beck and call of a Dalek, isn't that worth the risk?" John's brow furrowed as he considered. "I must think on this. If we act rashly, it could have grave consequences." "Don't think too long, John. I have already waited too long for this," Dio said with clenched teeth. As he said this, a Dalek glided towards them. Its eye stalk narrowed, eyeing the unretrieved girders at Dio's feet.
"Continue with your work. You will meet production quotas. Obey!"
the Dalek shouted. Dio glared with unbridled hatred at the over-bloated pepperpot.
"Failure to obey will result in punishment."
Dio bent over and lifted the girders. John turned and led the way to the construction site. Here, construction of a new Dalek city was underway. Why they wanted a city in a cold world such as this was beyond Dio, but they were tasked with building it with their bare hands, and for what reason? Daleks did tend to operate a little slower in cold temperatures, this was true, but they had machinery that could do the job faster, so why waste the slaves' time with it? The answer was obvious. It was all a big power trip. The Daleks lording it over their inferiors. Well, Dio did not like being an inferior, and he had a plan in place to reverse his fortunes. He felt it inside his very being like a power that slept, but would soon awaken. He did not know what form this would take, but his time was coming, and his revenge would be swift. As he did his job like a good little slave, helping construct the frame for the tallest level of the outpost base, he looked down at the entrance. He could make out a tall-winged humanoid. He knew who this was from reputation, having never met him personally before. Dio got John's attention and gestured downwards.
"Look who it is, the famous Demon of Mercy. Finally got around to seeing us then. Better late than never,"
Dio scoffed. "You know how vast the Empire is. He came to the system before, he just never had the chance to come here personally. We should be grateful we still reaped the benefits of his new system," John said, looking down at the hybrid with what Dio considered admiration. He began to see that John was not worthy to join his revolution. He was too tame, too housebroken. Dio felt the heat inside him now like a rising fire, but as he let his mind wander, he paid less attention to his duties. The girder he was holding in place, which a fellow slave, an older man with greying hair, was attempting to drill into place, slipped. This startled the old man, who dropped his drill, which burrowed into his own leg, spurting blood. The slave screamed in pain and lost his footing, falling backwards off the scaffolding. "Dio, you clumsy fool!" shouted John in anger. He watched the old man fall, and then with surprise he saw the Demon of Mercy lift from the ground with a roar of his thrusters. He soared upwards to catch the slave. He lowered him gently to the ground below. "Are you all right?" Ryuk asked the injured slave. His teeth were chattering, either from the cold or more likely from shock, but he nodded to Ryuk gratefully.
"Thank you, Demon of Mercy. Thank you,"
he said shakily. Ryuk nodded curtly and turned to a nearby Dalek. "Bring an anti-grav stretcher and get that leg seen to right away," he ordered.
"I obey,"
responded the Dalek, which filed away. A moment later 2 Daleks came with an anti-grav stretcher, which Ryuk hoisted the man effortlessly onto. As the Daleks carried him away, Ryuk looked up at the construction site.
"Shall we move on, General?"
asked Lex, who was approaching from behind. "In a moment," Ryuk said. He flew once more into the air and hovered over the slaves, who looked up at him with equal parts fear and awe. "What happened?" "That was careless and cannot be repeated." John stood forward defiantly. "We are sorry, Demon of Mercy. It was simply an accident," he said. "Who was responsible?" Ryuk asked. The slaves tried to look away, but all of their eyes at one point or another met with Dio's. Ryuk eyed the blonde-haired muscular man, who looked at him with hard eyes. "You, what is your name?" "I am Dio Brundell, and as John says, it was a simple accident. The old man should have been more careful," Dio said with disrespect. "Dio?" John chastised. "I am sorry, O Demon of Mercy, but some of us are less cooperative than others." "You mean some of us aren't as content of being the Daleks' lapdogs?" Dio bellowed. "Yes, you could say that." Ryuk glared at Dio. He hovered in close to him, so that they were eye to eye. He said in a quiet voice, "Listen to me, Dio Brundell. While I have done my best to improve the conditions for slaves, this only applies to those who abide by the system. You are displaying disruptive behavior, and if it continues, you may find yourself living in less than comfy conditions. Do I make myself clear?" Dio's eyes widened. He opened his mouth to speak. John was about to intercede, worried that Dio was about to get himself killed. But instead, Dio closed his mouth and said nothing. "Good," Ryuk answered. "Continue with your work." He flew away, and Dio seethed. He felt like he was seeing red, and as John looked at him, he began to notice that his eyes were indeed glowing red. "Dio, are you all right?" John asked in a whisper.
"No, I'm tired. Tired of being a slave. Tired of bowing to tyrants. Tired of grovelling to these freaks who dare to call themselves our masters,"
he shouted. As he did, Ryuk turned to look at him. He too noticed Dio's eyes glowing red, and he noticed that steam was rising from him, like he was emanating great heat. And as he raised a hand towards Ryuk, a ball of flame seemed to appear from nowhere and launch at him. Ryuk was sent reeling in circles, attempting to gain control of himself, and as he stopped the descent, he watched in horror as Dio, with a stomp of his foot, seemed to explode into a roaring fire, and the Harrmow outpost was torn asunder, the snow melting below, and the ice shattering like glass. The slaves screamed, some falling into a deep abyss below.